You are all waiting for the pièce de résistance, and so it is with enormous pleasure that I present my dear friend, Dr. Alain Goldschlager.
Thank you. It is a platitude to repeat that the voices of survivors of the Holocaust will soon disappear and leave a great void. But as a matter of fact, it can be easily argued that they have stopped giving us any original message and perspective on the event for a good dozen years now. Indeed, the most important and real literary expression of this human tragedy, machine is not obeying. I'm sorry. The most important and real literary expression of this human tragedy was written by survivors just after the liberation of the camp and the ghetto, and by hidden Jews all over Europe. We count 50,000 testimonial books written in over 30 languages over 70 years. This represents a very large library that makes the Holocaust probably the best documented event in history. But out of this incredible number of texts, few really transcend a fairly simple formula for the description of the war. And even fewer are truly giving us a clear and useful vision of the tragedy. It is possible to organize all those texts nevertheless and to categorize their approach. I have established 5 periods of writing which differ quite considerably, one from the other, to the point, and that will be, I hope, demonstrated, that the different narrative seem sometimes to describe distinct event. Each period brings a specific way of considering the nature and reality of the experience. The distance, memory, from the fact gives various perspectives, and the progressive instrumentation of the memory to serve diverse agenda impose new approaches to history. We would like here to concentrate on 2 specific periods of testimony in the hope to show the primal importance of Primo Levi, who gave us not only a clear and measured description of the life within the camp, but teach us how to grasp and interpret the human dynamic. His lucidity in describing event and human makes his voice one of the most important, and I would dare sometimes to think, the most important voice to tell us the story. The first period of writing that I determined was composed of writing done during the war, or sometimes even before the war, and they gave us an immediate reaction of the person in face of events that are happening in front of their eyes. And the only thing that they do, they record it without any attempt to understand what's happening, because they have no perspective whatsoever, and they cannot have any perspective. The second period that I would like to point out and develop is a very, very, very short period right after the war, 1945 to 1952 exactly. During that brief time, survivors threw onto paper all their emotions, their grief, their suffering, their lost life, and the role and the loss of parents, family, and friends. Their despair of holding any future. But the book can always play, and it did at that period, the role of a catharsis that liberates them by telling their story, or more exactly, and I insist on that, the story of all of the victims. Indeed, their individual testimonial voice are the voices of all the martyrs, dead or alive. The voices are the one of the dead as much as the one of the living. The author do not control the narrative, and it sounds like a true confession. The text often appear disorganized, but Primo Levi makes it clear when it writes in 1947 in the introduction of Se questo è un uomo, the need to tell our story to the rest of the world, to make the rest participate in it, had taken on for us before our liberation and after, to the point of competing with other elementary needs. The book has been written to satisfy this need first and foremost. Therefore, as an internal liberation. Hence, its fragmentary character, the chapter have both been written not in logical succession, but in order of urgency. And I think it's very important because this lack of organization becomes a mark of a lot of other things that we would like to analyze here. Let me underline some of those notions presented here. The book is a liberation. The book is a liberation, psychological as much as physical. It is spontaneous and thus disorganized. It does not try to convince anyone of anything, and it doesn't question. It does not try to explain or give any interpretation of the how and the why of the event. Survivors know that too many ideas and search for understanding can be very dangerous in a camp. Thinking break your spirits, and hope is treacherous because it keeps you as an obedient prisoner. The other is very conscious that he does not speak with one individual voice. But his word sounds the echo of a group of prisoners who share their experience. And here I would like to divert a moment for one thing, that two notions that are extraordinarily important is the difference between autobiography and testimony. What is an autobiography? It is somebody telling the story of his life. This means to tell the story of your life, you start at the beginning, birth, family, event of youth and development, certain event, and up to, theoretically, today. So you have a long, progressive narrative. But what is important is that the ego of the person is at the center. It is the skeleton of the story, of the narrative. And for that, even in the very short description that I gave, you have the full organization according to chronology, from birth to now. So everything is organized, and the text is that to explain the person. And the text also has to say, and says in a more subtle way, my story is interesting. Why would you spend hours reading the story of somebody of no interest? So I am important, and I'm so important that it's worth you losing time reading my story. That's an autobiography, regardless of which time or period it is. Now, what happens with a testimony? In a testimony, what is at the heart of everything is not the person, it is the event himself. So it's not me in the event, autobiography, but it's the event through me. And that total reversal makes it totally different. For instance, the testimony, since it's centered on the event, starts when the event starts. So what we have in testimonies, the testimony starts, the German entered the village on February 1941. That's the beginning. It's not when the author was born, it's when the event starts. And all the testimonies, seriously, end up at the liberation of the camp or the liberation of the person. And it's over. What happens after is irrelevant. So we have also, in a testimony, and it's very clear with Primo Levi, a commitment, an affirmation to tell the truth. I'm not playing games. I don't have to show off. It's not me. It's the event that is important. Lying about the event doesn't make sense. Okay? And one thing also, especially for the text that we are interested in, placing distance or fictionalize anything is perceived as a betrayal. Especially with the fact that there are so many close people who died, not telling the truth is betraying family and friends. Okay? And most survivors, if not all, had some guilt about having survived while family and friends didn't. And so not telling their story is another betrayal. So in the testimony, we have this kind of strong need to tell the truth. Okay? Lying, fictionalizing anything becomes a sin. So what I would like to do here is to argue that Primo Levi's work are among the very few true testimonies we have. His narrative represents the clearest and most authentic expression of life in the camp and the impact on humans. And it's the ultimate reference for me that we shall use them to measure all the distortion that we shall encounter after the 1952 period. Even his later works were able to keep the tone and concept of the original Sequestro e un uomo, and Levi did not transform the image of the camp into the experience of his own. In a way, he did speak about his life, but in a way, he never changed his text into an autobiography, truly. Primo Levi was always able to keep a double vision of event, one that strictly described the process of the concentration system, the other of the inmates, including himself, and finds a practical and emotional way to deal with it. The portrayal of daily life paints a routine that would only be broken by death or a happy event. He always kept the deep respect that for the total situation, the all for all, and having researched the dramatic side of the tragedy, he gives a summary of the timelines routine that, like Sisyphus, the Greek myth of pushing the stone up the hill, is. In taking time out of the equation, Levi was able to transmit to us the inner feeling of the camp. And as he says, in the Lager, the German term for camps, concentration Lager, when you say never, it means tomorrow morning. And it's important because his manipulation, which was the one of many survivors, or inmates, should I say, in the camp, is that time was different. And it's the first thing to understand for reading properly testimony. Let us take another example. Reading the future does not imply hopes of liberation or improvement in the living condition, but simply the exact reproduction of the difficult condition of the previous time. Nothing changed in a concentration camp from one to the next day, to the next day, to the next day. And that is a new vision of life when time doesn't exist. So when we're thinking far would be dangerous. Primo Levi sees the winter of 1945 arriving. He was interned already for about a year, and here is a description of the event. We know what it means, winter coming, because we were here last winter. And the other will soon learn. It means that in the course of these months, from October to April, 7 out of 10 will die. And it's kind of a striking element. That's a constant. We just will notice 7 out of 10 will die. That's it. Whoever does not die will suffer minute by minute, all day, every day, through the morning before dawn until the distribution of the evening soup. We will keep our muscle continuously tense, dance from foot to foot, beat our arms around under the shoulder against the cold. We will have to spend bread to acquire gloves, and those hours of sleep to repair them when they become unstitched. This is winter. Time is just pure repetition, and repetition of what? Suffering. One could notice the simplicity of the 7 out of 10 will die, because in that 7 out of 10, one of the 7 could be Primo Levi, and he accepts it. It is part of the reading of reality. And indeed, the 7 out of 10 is put at the same level of importance than unstitched glove, and that 7 life gloves. That has the same value, basically, in the vision. Levi's placid and reserved tone characterize his writing. There's no drama here, no emotional explosion of fear or anguish, simply the recording of the difficult condition everyone will endure, with the practical consequence, death, his own possibly, an unstitched glove. Time has disappeared from the narration because Levi and the other prisoner knew the only change that would occur would be their death. The only change will be their death. The challenge that Levi throws at us is to try to perceive the world as they did, without any anticipation of a future and a present that does not expand beyond today. Having eliminated time from his perception of living, he isolates himself and others from this perception that many survivors articulated after the war. Our ignorance allowed us to live as we are in the mountain and your rope is frayed and about to break, but you don't know it and feel safe. This kind of words underline the message that he will reiterate that none survive because of special qualities, which enter often in discussion with autobiographies, where the author may call on special circumstances or qualities for surviving. The very shy nature of Primo Levi comes out for sure, but this attitude is very, very common. But Primo Levi had the talent of a poet and a man of letters to express his feeling, but also the feelings of his world. As a matter of fact, my own father-in-law used to say, thinking in the camp were very dangerous. It was draining your energy. Often, Levi invites us to consider moments of life in a surprising way, giving us, for instance, this surprising moment comment on his incarceration and giving a surprising optimistic instruction. Sooner or later in life, everyone discovers that perfect happiness is unrealizable. But there are few who stop to consider the antithesis, that perfect unhappiness is equally unattainable. That's where he is. Even for author who wrote soon after the war, few kept the description of the organization and the mechanic of the camp so clear and understandable. Primo Levi avoids any analysis or assumption on the motive, rationale, or goal of what was happening and of the system. He just gives us a report of what is. He may suggest some idea, but does not even ever pretend that he would have a better intelligence of the human nature that created the camps. Having, and I repeat, but a very shy nature, Primo Levi avoided all his life going into too much detail about his own experience. He pointed out that if he survived, it was not because of any specific or uncommon quality of trait, it was simply that he has been lucky, and that death was watching. He points out that out of the 6,500 Italians sent to the Nazi camp, out of a total Jewish Italian population of around 43,000 in 1940, less than 500 came back, and he was one of those. The proportion of 1 out of 10 is quite an average for camps. Primo Levi kept insisting on the fact that his own experience was of very limited interest and did not hesitate to minimize his experience. He who survives the camps are not true witnesses. We are those who, through prevarication, skill, or luck, never touch bottom. Those who have and who have seen the face of the Gorgon did not return, or returned worthless. And indeed, we speak always of people who died in the gas chamber, but we don't have one testimony of anybody having lived that experience. There were 3 survivors, but they were killed right after surviving the gassing. The transformation from testimony to autobiography in the publication of Survivor was a slow process. But after a transitory third period, we encounter a totally different recording of the experience told by Survivor. Between the years 1980 and 2000, Survivor were holding a discourse that tells a totally different story. Engaged in a struggle against denier, all writers had a specific goal, which is to prove that the Holocaust indeed happened, and he or she wanted to add their own stone to the edifice of proof. This book became historical and familial narrative with multiple maps and documents, but more importantly, the author, often grandparents, wished to give a moral and ethical lesson to their grandchildren. Even more, the narrative tends to illustrate a fundamental lesson that individual can live through the worst calamitous events survive and recreate a family and a social life. The reality of the camp was inhuman and its description gruesome. It becomes impossible to render it truthfully and factually if one tries to give ethical and societal lesson to the reader. Thus, the camp in those autobiography, the camps tend to get removed in a symbolic background where horror is postulated more than portrayed. In the process, the story of individual escaping death take precedence to the daily cruelty illustrated by Levi, and we vibrate for the author of the autobiographies, knowing full well that they escaped the worst. In Primo Levi, death is an omnipresent actor and indeed interact non-stop with the voice. And sometimes we know that she was called and welcomed. Thus, we have a progressive slide that goes from a description of the worst atrocities imposed to human to a glorification of the capacity of human to go through unimaginable hardship and come out as an example of hope and determination. Our world, and especially North America, remain fairly obsessed with finding a happy ending to all stories. The optimistic perspective imposed by the spirit of society did progressively transform the narrative of the Holocaust into a positive story by centering the drama of the war on the world of the survivor. Who, by definition, went through the ordeal but survived. Survivors' autobiography offer a celebration of the human spirit and its capacity to confront evil and learn from the experience without breaking. And it neglect to mention the cost that was there. Once again, 9 deaths for one survivor. We feel that there is a grave danger in that positive image of survival imposed on the reality of the Nazi massacre. Thank you. By keeping this balanced perspective of the human experience and an exclusive focus on its reality of the camp, Primo Levi will remind the reader in his numerous publications that there were no true personal lessons to take out of the war, but one could make a scientific research on the society of the camp. In that scene, his work are essential to keep the right tone and the right perspective. Primo Levi stated that his goal in writing Se questo è un uomo was to provide, and I quote, documents for a dispassionate study of certain aspects of human soul. This maybe give us some clue for explaining his amazing capacity to refrain from emotional outbursts and to keep amazing clarity of vision. Maybe understanding his ultimate goal will help us. Wait a minute. So, we can perhaps ask ourselves, is it necessary or good to retain any memory of this exceptional human state? Amazing statement. After coming out of a camp, should we remember our suffering of years? To this question, we feel that we have to reply in the affirmative. We would like to consider that the lager was preeminently a gigantic biological and social experiment. Thousands of individuals, different in age, condition, origin, language, culture, and custom, are enclosed within barbed wire. They will live a regular, controlled life which is identical for all and inadequate to all needs and which is more rigorous than any experimenter could have set up to establish what is the essential and what is advantageous to the conduct of the human animal in the struggle for life. Through this word and the entire book, one could recognize the particular tone that Primo Levi can take while speaking of the world of hell he lived in for a year. Indeed, enlarging the perspective, history can reveal man in his biological primacy and in its most basic social linkage, and provide a new reading of our world. Primo Levi's perception that the concentration system represents a vast human experiment and could provide additional knowledge of the human soul and spirit reveal a profound secular mind. He never tried to find universal explanation or answer spiritual question. He wants to learn about the human in its totality and advocate that for doing so, you have to try to know and accept the very basic fact of behavior, psychological reaction, and social interaction almost in its biological format. For all the rest of his life, Primo Levi would come back to his gigantic biological and social experiment that Auschwitz was, and that he personally experienced with the same attitude and sight. Even if sometimes his approach may appear to change. In his major texts, like The Drowned and the Saved, The Truth, Moment of Reprieve, and his masterpiece, The Periodic Table, he positioned himself in the same way. The events are object of study, and the proper and detailed description of every parcel of the ensemble will lead to the proper understanding of the totality and of its totality of the system and its dynamic. As a scientific mind, he can only underline what he will only speak on reality, then the confronted and explored personally. The critics have often neglected to underline that Primo Levi was a true poet, writing poems and novels when living his laboratory and his profession as a chemist. We cannot forget the quality of his rendering of the world by elegant phrasing and touching languages. His beautiful intelligence kept a lightness and a vivid coloration that cannot always be properly translated, but nevertheless pierce through the books. In the way to a conclusion, we try to take an overview of the scene so as to better perceive Primo Levi's importance. When we consider an event like the Shoah, another way to call the Holocaust, mostly used in Europe, what are we considering? The event in itself, in its reality, or are we looking at its relevancy for the world of today? Do we want to know history, or are we eager to learn from history? More than with most historical events, the Shoah has become, mainly since the 1980s, a vast intellectual field of research on ethical, psychological ground. Everyone is searching for lessons to be transmitted to the next generation. And the Holocaust is manipulating for giving a special perspective on all events, human, political, or social. It serves in the classroom, and journalists refers to it as soon as a large conflict threatens the planet. In the process, the reference to the Holocaust are losing their substance, and the word become a mummification of the events. Unlike the heartfelt slogan of survivor in the immediate after war, never again, has progressively lost its energy and meaning by being repeated non-stop in all circumstances to reach the present situation where it is a truism that would not carry the enthusiasm of the crowd. As all slogan, the Holocaust is at risk of becoming a simple word with little historical or human connotation. As we pointed out, the pressure of our society to see the world in a positive light is in the process of potentially distorting the message of the Holocaust and of history. The trust to use the Holocaust in a pedagogical way force the educator to present it as a series of lessons as to improve our society. For instance, as Michael Maris pointed out in his last book, one of the prime lessons of the Holocaust is supposed to affirm that the Holocaust represents a school for tolerance, and that interpretation is rather questionable. Of course, while speaking about intolerance, one could refer to the Holocaust as its absolute opposite. But in a desire to give to the youth a positive lesson, many educators promote the idea that studying the Holocaust should open the mind of one to tolerance by deepening their knowledge of and appreciation of ethnic, cultural, and racial diversity. But it seems like quite a twist to use the most dramatic humiliation of a people for teaching virtues and a balanced humanity. The Holocaust is the absolute opposite of tolerance, and this is quite a twist to use the most dramatic and inhuman event in history for teaching its opposite. It cannot be accomplished without manipulation and without manipulation. The question becomes, how far are we getting from the reality of 1940, 1945? And do we understand it in the term of 1945 or in those of 2018? In view of those approaches that could very likely distort the memory of the Holocaust forever if we are not attentive, the voice of Primo Levi remains essential to keep the true message of the experience of the camp in a proper reading. The early testimonies, 1945, 1952, describe the world that remains inexplicable, and if we try to do so, we surely will lose the. And if we try to understand the Holocaust any other way, we surely will lose the truth and the human truth of the event. It is too easy to adjust the narrative to accommodate our present social and psychological concept of how men should live in a group. Primo Levi sent us a reminding challenge. If your vision would not conform to Auschwitz II, it is limited and does not reach the essence of what a human being actually is and can do. If we cannot match our perception with his description, can we hope to be on the right track? When a reader puts down the book, like Sequestro e un uomo, his own personal and intimate journey begins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain, for that brilliant and articulate presentation. It strikes a very personal chord for me. My father, as Alain knows, we've had this conversation, wrote his own narrative in 1946, so he fits into that first category. Now we will take questions. There are 3 microphones set up in the aisles there, so if you would like to ask a question, please stand in front of the microphone. And you know, sometimes at these events, there are some people who like to make speeches, so if you would please not and ask a question, we would invite you to do that now.